We'd like to give a special thank you to Pure Project for hosting the Society of Barley Engineers. Thank you.
So I promise this presentation will be quick and painless. So this is Brewing with AI by me, Andre McKay. So the way I'm going to structure this presentation is I'm going to have a handful of slides basically talking about what AI is, what it can do, how it works, and then we'll get into the beer part because we know that's the most important part of this presentation. So first thing, what is artificial intelligence or AI? So AI is the process of using computational systems to perform tasks that a human would do. So basically it's training a computer to think and act like a human would do. And that includes things like learning, reasoning, problem solving, perception, and decision making. So, everything that you do in the normal course of a day to, work out a problem or do a task or anything like that, we're trying to, not we as in, the we as in the global we, not the we as in us in this room, are trying to train computer systems to be able to do the same thing. So how are they accomplishing this? So the biggest thing is search and optimization. So basically they're going out and they're crawling and finding information and optimizing how that information is processed. And they're using logic. So, basically if A plus B equals C, they're following through that path. They're trying to use the same reasoning processes that a human would do to be able to do that. Probabilistic methods for uncertain reasoning, classifiers and statistical learning methods, artificial and neural networks, deep learning, and generative pre-trained transformers, which is GPT. And now GPT is mostly what we're going to be focusing on. And as I said, this is the star of the show. So how does GPT work? Now, first of all, there are AI solutions out there like ChatGPT that you have GPT in their name. GPT is more a method of doing it, and they've used that as part of their name. So the biggest thing is they use large language models. So what that does is it generates text based on the semantic relationships between words and sentences. So they're able to take a sentence that you give them, they're able to analyze it and parse it and figure out what you're trying to mean by that sentence. Because if you just take it from a strict structural object, there can be many meanings to a sentence. So by going through and figuring out how a normal human would interpret this sentence and training the models to follow that, it's able to give a more precise, more precise representation of what you're trying to ask. Now, how it accomplishes a lot of this is it trains it on large sources of text. Part of the reason why a lot of the companies that are heavily invested in AI are Google, Microsoft, X, a lot of these companies, they have these large sets of data. Google's been crawling the web for, 30 years. So they basically have this database of how people talk and interact and write, and they're able to train their models on this to be able to give more of an exact representation on not only what is being asked of it, but how to properly formulate that answer and provide the answer to you. And then prediction-based responses. Again, that gets into analyzing how a human would talk and act and being able to train their response so that it matches that. So it's more of a natural conversation. Instead of just talking to a computer and it giving you an answer back, what it's able to do is it's able to not only give you an answer, but be able to speak more how a human would speak and give you more information in that than you would normally be expecting. And as we get into some of the examples that I have later on, you'll see that the responses that it gives you are almost as if you're talking to a person. It's not exact, as most of this stuff is, and it gets better all the time, but it's pretty close to the way you would have an interaction with someone. And then reinforcement learning. So part of what happens with a lot of these GPT solutions is as you ask it a question and it gives you an answer, it's iterative. So you can then say, okay, if it says 2 + 2 is 5, and you say, well, I don't think that's necessarily the correct answer, it'll go back and take your response and its original response, look at those and analyze them and realize, oh, I've made a mistake. The proper answer is 4. So it's able to basically learn learn based on how the human is interacting with it, and that trains it for responses that it's going to give to other people down the road. So all the time where you're asking it questions and getting answers, it's improving its database and improving its answers. And that's why if you get an answer from it, and we'll talk about this in a few slides, where you get an answer that's, basically BS, by going and telling it that and telling it the reasons why, you're helping to train it so it gives a better answer down the road. Now, one of the big problems with AI right now is the ethical implications. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what happens with GPT is it goes out and the language learning models goes out and crawls the web. A lot of that information that it's sucking in and analyzing is copyrighted material. It's material that someone is the author of and has a reason to use it, and they're the person who should be using it. And by scraping this stuff and gathering the information from it and being able to do it, there's some ethical implications on that. Privacy. If there's stuff on there that, because it's scraping all the stuff that's essentially out there on the web and using it to base its information, there's stuff in deep databases somewhere that may be private information that you don't want out there. And if GPT are able to scrape that stuff and give those answers back to you, there's some privacy concerns. Copyright, I just mentioned. Natural resources. A lot of the stuff with AI is very resource intensive. So you're hearing of huge, big data, basically data centers that are being built. Not only do they have power requirements, but they've got cooling requirements. They use a lot of water for their cooling and stuff. So it's putting a strain on a lot of the natural resources. And so part of the question that needs to be asked is the use of those natural resources worth what we're getting out of it? So, and that's kind of a question that everybody needs to, answer for their own selves. Misinformation and weaponized AI, and this happens a lot. It used to be where, if somebody wanted to put some misinformation out, they kind of had to put a little bit of effort into it. They had to make the images, they had to write the text. Now, somebody can give AI a prompt and it can come up with an image of, sharks swimming down a flooded street in some city that had a hurricane blow through. That's not necessarily true, and a lot of times an AI generator is the one that did that. So, people who are using this stuff for nefarious purposes, it now makes their job a lot easier. And some of the images are so good that it's very hard to figure out whether it's real or not. So, that's can be used for purposes that you don't necessarily want it used for. Transparency. When an AI image is generated or an AI block of text, if the author of the person who gave the prompt for that doesn't necessarily state clearly that an AI system generated this and they basically pass it off as their own information, it's hard to tell sometimes. It used to be you could tell because there was, the way the text was written or the way the image was done, it was very obvious. AI generation is getting very good now, and it gets better every time. So it ends up being really hard to distinguish the crap out there versus the legitimate stuff. So, that's a problem that, we're going to have to figure out. And, it may be putting watermarks in images. I don't know if you guys noticed. So the two images that I had on the meeting agenda slides talking about the upcoming meetings, those are AI generated images. Now, both of those, I used Google's Gemini for that. Google is now watermarking the bottom corner of the image to say AI. However, that is very easy to crop out. So, while they are watermarking stuff, that can be bypassed, so it's hard to tell sometimes. And then bias. So a lot of times when you ask a question, even unintentionally, your viewpoints and your attitudes to something can be reflected in how you ask the question. And if you ask a question a certain way, the answer may come out the way you're intending. So, it's hard to sometimes divorce that and not be able to, influence what you're asking these AI generators to do. So if somebody is using it and they have, some sort of bias that's coming out with it, that could be reflected in the answer. Lauren, we got a question over here.
I was reading an article the other day, and it said if you ask ChatGPT a question in the form of a quest or make it like its mission, it'll answer you much better and give you a more detailed answer.
Yeah, and a lot of that is knowing knowing how to ask things and asking things in a certain way that, it's able to better understand the question you're asking. So as you said, if you ask it with, a very definite, I'm seeking this or something like that, it's able to better formulate an answer. So, but again, there's a bias involved in that, right? Because if you decide you're going to ask a question a very certain way, you may get an answer that's reflecting the question you're asking in the intent you're asking, but it may not necessarily reflect the real answer that you can get. So it's, again, this isn't quite the wild, wild west we're talking about, but it's pretty damn close right now. So things are changing minute by minute, and all this stuff is being fleshed out. So now, how many here has used AI for something at all? Okay, all right, so a good number of you. We're Barley Engineers. Engineers is in the name. It's not surprising at all. So for those of you that haven't or who have used other solutions, I've got a list here of ones. So we've got Gemini, formerly Bard. I kind of like the name Bard better than Gemini, but that's Google's AI. And all of the questions that I am going to have in this presentation are all done through Gemini. I'm not saying one of these is better than the other. That's just what I defaulted to. So we have ChatGPT, another big one. I've heard a lot of people mention ChatGPT earlier. That's done by OpenAI. We have Grok, which is X. Microsoft has Copilot. And then there are two that I hadn't heard of until I was doing the research for this. There's Claude, which is by Anthropic. And then there's Llama, which is actually an open source AI option. So for those of you that are concerned about privacy and copyright, it being open source, that gives you the opportunity, if you know what you're looking at, to be able to inspect the code and the source and all that. So really, really high level coding stuff. But it's there. And open source is important in a lot of these things because, as I mentioned on the previous slide, bias. A company is going to have a bias, right? And a lot of time it's to sell their products and do things like that. So it's important that if those are your concerns, navigating to an open source one may be a better solution for you. I'm sorry? DeepSeek, yeah, and there's there's a bunch of others on here, but I hit the main ones, and yeah, as Justin was saying, DeepSeek, is a Chinese government one, so it's yeah. All right, so let's talk about some failures and downsides of AI. So failures in AI are typically referred to as hallucinations, right? Because you ask it a question and it gives you this answer that is just way the hell out there. Think of somebody walking through the desert and seeing a mirage and a hallucination. That's essentially what AI is doing. If we're going to assign a thing to it. So plausible sounding random falsehoods. Now, I actually had experience with this one just the other day. So I'm also doing the presentation in November, which roughly put is basically going to be historic Canadian beer styles, involved with some family history for that. So I was doing some research, and I wanted to know basically a specific beer style that would have been brewed in Eastern Canada around the 1900s. So Gemini came back to me and said a Russian Imperial Stout. So, 1900s Canada, Montreal, a Russian Imperial Stout, a mango-flavored IPA. So don't trust everything that an AI tells you. Plausible sounding random falsehoods. So now what happened with that, as I dug into those further, because I wanted to see, okay, where did this go horribly wrong? Reading one of the source, so in Gemini, when it gives you a result, you're able to dig into it and figure out, okay, how did it kind of generate this? And so one of the links that it had was talking about one of the styles with the way they did the hops had a fruitiness to it. Well, Gemini looked at that and said, fruitiness, mangoes, perfect. Nowhere close to it. So part of being a good user of AI, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is you need to have some reference in what you're asking it and background in what you're asking it to do to be able to vet the information and make sure that it isn't giving you a load of BS. So text on images, that's just random gibberish or glyphs. So if you look down at the bottom, that was a poster that was done for some sort of scam festival, I believe, somewhere in Europe. It was some sort of Willy Wonka chocolate thing. It was big in the news about 6 months ago. That was the text that was at the bottom of it talking about what was going on. Catting, live performances, catchy tunes, Carchiton, sorry, I missed the T in there. Extra ready lollipops and a paradise of sweet teats. So, not quite what they were intending to say. But the problem is, somebody looking, and this was on a poster, this was the little text at the bottom of the poster. Somebody looking at the poster may not necessarily catch all that. Their brain may kind of interpret what was written there, and it's not exactly what was written there. So sometimes in AI image generation, it has a real problem with basically words, natural language words. Sometimes it will even just be random glyphs that aren't letters at all. So you can watch out for that. One example, Coca-Cola did an AI-generated ad around Christmas time last year. One of the images in there was of a Coca-Cola truck. AI misspelled Coca-Cola. There are 2 O's in cola. Nobody caught it, right? Because it was like 2 frames in a longer image, but it was there and it was wrong. So that's something that commonly happens. Wrong number of fingers. AI has a huge problem with hands. Nobody knows why. It cannot get the proper number of digits on each hand. So if you look at an image and it was an AI-generated human, a lot of times, you're going to end up with 7 fingers on one hand. So just be aware of that. And then low-quality images. And I don't mean low quality as in low resolution. I mean low quality as in garbage images. One of the examples that I saw, and I didn't put the image on there, was somebody tasked AI with coming up with images of a shrimp Jesus. And it was basically a amalgamation of a bunch of different things, and you look at these images and you can very easily tell that there was no effort put into this at all, that it was basically somebody asking a prompt and they got an image back that kind of looks like the reference things but not quite. So that's another dead giveaway. If you look at an image and basically it's like, yeah, there's just something wrong with this, that's a lot of times a giveaway that it's AI generated. Now, AI has a big thing in popular culture. So this is kind of just a quick gallery of AI as we've been told throughout science fiction and fiction, throughout the years. We, of course, have data from Star Trek, which, of course, knowing me, that's going to be on here. So the other thing is, the Star Trek computer, the ship computer in the Enterprise, that is essentially an AI. You can ask it natural language questions. It gives you a natural language answer back. It's able to process vast amounts of information. So then we have Cylons from Battlestar Galactica. We have the classic toaster Cylons from the 1970s Galactica, and then we have Cylons, both flesh and robot, in the new Battlestar Galactica series. Which, if you've never watched it, I highly recommend it. Ryan can vouch for that also. So we've got Wall-E, we have HAL 9000, we of course have a Terminator and Skynet, which Skynet is the evil AI, and so a lot of times people will refer to AI, especially Google's AI, as Skynet, and they're getting pretty damn close. And because if I didn't put it up here, people were going to complain. We have R2-D2 and C-3PO. We have Rachel from Blade Runner, and we have Kit from Knight Rider. These are all examples of AI. And AI in science fiction is something that is very common. Even things that you may not think is an artificial intelligence, a lot of times it is. So just an example. Now, the question you all are asking, how do I brew with AI? And that's the important part of this presentation. So what I basically did was I gave AI a handful of different prompts, and it spit out a beer recipe. So we'll go through those one by one. But first I want to talk about, in terms of AI and brewing, what can't it do? I'm sorry, what can it do? Can't it do is the next slide. What can it do? So brewing to style. So if you want to create a beer recipe and you want to brew a specific style, you can go look online. There's hundreds, thousands of recipes. You can, read books like Brewing Classic Styles, or you can basically say AI, hey, I want to brew this specific style. Make me a recipe, right? Substitutions, and this happens a lot where, let's say you've got a recipe you like. There's a particular hop that you can't find or isn't available. You can say, okay, I'm looking for, I have a recipe with this hop. I'm looking for something that's similar to it. What can you suggest? So there's the thing you can do with that. Brewing from inventory. So 2 of the recipes that I'm going to share later on, part of the seed question that I gave AI was I basically gave it a PDF output from my brewfather reflecting the inventory that I had on hand. And I structured the prompt to say, analyze this PDF file, and basically using this and whatever I want to do, use the ingredients that I have on hand. And that's useful if you are keeping track of your stuff and you realize that you've got a bunch of inventory that you're sitting on. You can use AI to help you utilize that in a way that you may not necessarily be able to do yourself. And then fixing brewing disasters. So if you're in the middle of a brew day, getting back to the hop example, and you realize, crap, I didn't have these hops I was expecting, what can I do with that? Or I threw it, I have a wee heavy that didn't turn out anything like I was expecting, and so I've asked, okay, what do I do to fix this? So, fixing a broken beer is definitely a valid use for this. So, one of the things that I want to make sure to point out is treat AI like another tool in your toolbox. It is another resource for you to use. It's not necessarily the be-all, end-all, but it's like walking to your shelf and picking out a reference book. Use it like that, as a tool. Now, what can't it do? So be creative. So as humans, creativity is one of those things that we have ingrained in our brains. An AI or a language learning model, it doesn't necessarily have that. It's getting there, but that's part of what makes humans human. So expecting an AI to be able to be completely creative is probably something you're not going to accomplish. Adjust for your brewing system. So all of the recipes that I used AI for, I still had to do some adjustment on the back end to fit the system that I use. So whether it gave you an exact amount of grain, I know that my system uses something slightly different, my Brewzilla. So I had to adjust for that. So you're going to need to do that. Make on-the-fly corrections. Now, if you're right in the middle of something, you have to have an answer really quick. Your brain is going to be a lot better than asking the AI. So replace experts or artists. This is the important thing. Now, a lot of us have a lot of brewing experience. What you don't want to do is depend on this 100% for that. A lot of times your experience and the data that you've gathered over your whole the whole time brewing is going to be probably more valuable than what an AI is going to give you. And especially when it comes to artists, I want to make sure that when we're doing things like creating images and things that we're not, putting someone like Todd out of work. We want to make sure that, we're supporting the artists and the creative people, that are helping all of us and not using AI as a tool to cut them out and replace them completely. So what's important with AI is trust but verify. And I mentioned this before, you have to have sufficient knowledge in what you're asking and what you're doing to make sure the answer that AI gives you is something that makes sense or not, right? So you don't want to go off and just blindly trust it. So we've used AI in my 9-to-5 job. Alex, who's online, my dad, writes a lot of code. And a lot of times when we're stuck on a problem or something, we'll toss it to AI. And there have been times where it's come back and the answer's been spot on. There's also been times where it's come back and it has no idea what the hell it's talking about. But you have to know, you have to have enough of a basis in that to be able to understand that what it's telling you is BS. So that's why treat it as a tool, not as the end-all be-all. So let's talk about the first brewing challenge that I did, and I'm calling this Send in the Clones.
Hi, can I teach you a lesson?
All right, so the first beer, if I can get my 2 beer pourers. No, I did not.
Too bad AI can't serve the beer. How do we?
Yeah, I know.
That would be great.
There you go.
Oh, these are dangerous.
Yes, and I do have a pair of... Here, I have helpers just in case.
The same beer?
It's the same beer, yeah, so if you guys want to start on different areas. All right, so the first beer I'm calling Badgie. So again, Star Trek reference. Star Trek had an animated series that just finished after 5 seasons. Badgie was basically think of Clippy from Microsoft. For those of you that remember the little paper clip that showed up, he basically is an evil AI. So, was that? Paramount Plus. It was called Star Trek Lower Decks. Yeah, so think of Family Guy, The Simpsons, South Park, kind of an irreverent take, but very, very, very good. So, okay, so this is the prompt that I gave AI. So I basically said, I want to brew an all-grain Guinness clone, come up with a suitable recipe that uses the ingredients from my attached inventory spreadsheet. So again, what I did was I took the output from Brewfather, a PDF of what my inventory on hand was, and uploaded that when I gave it the prompt. So it was able to analyze that PDF, figure out what I had, and generate the recipe accordingly. And this is what Gemini answered with.
Based on your inventory and common Guinness clone recipes, here's a suitable all-grain recipe for a 5-gallon batch, highlighting what you have and what you will need to acquire.
And if any of you are interested, the QR code that says Gemini, that will actually take you to the exact query and prompt that I gave it. I summarized a lot of it on the next slide, but there is some more information there if anyone's interested. And this QR code will come up again in a little bit. So basically what it came back with is it says, this recipe aims for a dry Irish stout similar to Guinness with an approximate OG of 1042 to 1046, FG of 1010 to 1012, and an AB of 4.2 to 4.7. So again, it analyzed what I had on hand. It said 6.5 pounds of Admiral Pills, 1.5 pounds flake barley, 3/4 pound of roasted barley at 300 Lovibond. It says normally it would want 500, but you got 300, it'll work. And then optional rice hulls if you have a mash problem. So hops, it looked at what I had again, and it said use the 1.5 ounces of Northern Brewer that you have. Yeast, I didn't have any yeast on hand for this, so it said Why Yeast Irish Ale or White Labs Irish Ale. I used the White Labs one, and I got that from Travis. And then optional Irish moss or Wolflock, lactic acid to get that Guinness tang, which I did not add to this. So it also was helpful, and it basically gave me brewing instructions. Now, I put this here. I followed this somewhat. It was pretty standard. There wasn't anything that there wasn't a deviation. There wasn't something that was odd. So I just put this here for reference. If this would be a good exercise for someone who didn't have a lot of brewing experience, this is basically how you would do it. Nothing in here jumps out at me as being wrong. So.
Enjoy your homebrew Guinness clone.
And that is what it told me at the end of the recipe. So, now how did it compare? So what I did was I took the information that AI gave me, I took all of that, put it into my Brewfather app, and that's what Brewfather calculated, and then that is what the actuals ended up being, right? So AI calculated, said 1042, 1046, Brewfather with the same ingredients, adjusted for my brewing, my system, said 1046, right? Actual ended up being 1048, so pretty damn close. Final gravity, 1010 to 1012. Brewfather calculated 1012. I got 1012, right on. 4.2 to 4.7. Brewfather 4.5. I got 4.7, right? So I got a little better attenuation on that. So again, Gemini link down there. The Brewfather link is to the recipe as I entered it in Brewfather for my system. So if anyone's interested in that. What does everybody think about the beer? Yeah, let's get the microphone coming around.
So when you asked AI, did it give you an inventory of like what you needed to actually brew with it? Like, did you need kettles? How much water you needed? And like what kind of other instrumentation that you might actually need and have to have, or if you needed sanitization? Or is this just only on brewing and that's it? So you actually need to know, like, well, what I'm trying to say is, if you are trying to go and have your intro into brewing, do you think this would actually be a suitable just intro to it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that gets into how you structure the question, right? So the way I structured the question was more coming from a position of, I already know how to brew, I'm looking for this, give me a recipe. If I had structured the question more of, this is my first time brewing beer, I'd like to do this, I don't have any equipment, how can you help me? I think then it would probably give you an answer that was more, okay, you need to make sure you have a system that can do it, or, a mash tun, or, basically all of the ingredients. Or it may even go so far as to say, here is an extract base. I do believe I said all grain in my prompt. I usually do that just to make sure that I'm not being vague in that. But, you could have very easily said, I want to do an extract brew. Give me a recipe for that. And that would be good for someone, just getting into it. They would still need the other stuff. But in this example, it did not give me, you need to make sure you have, a mash tun, a fermentation chamber, and all that stuff. So it didn't necessarily do that.
So I'm just curious if your inventory had, so the recipe called for a Pilsner malt in there, and which maybe might not be what you would, because you had Pilsner malt probably.
Yes.
I don't know if you had any two-row or something like that. Anything else or English malts or anything like that in your inventory?
Yeah, no, I didn't for this. I do think I had some regular two-row in there, but I think that the way it, I think it was the pills that I had, and it used that as the base. So.
Yeah, I mean, it turned out pretty good. I mean, I think it's it's fairly close to what you would do, but maybe if you were adjusting it, you might decide to use a malt that had more English malt character to it.
And that's a very good point that you're making, Andy, and that comes into where we all have a good knowledge base on this to begin with, so we can suggest things on top of it that will change it a little bit. So, Kurt.
One of the things that comes up a lot when you're using AI is refinement. Mm-hmm. So when with this question about did it tell you what equipment you need, the best way to deal with AI that I've found is that you ask an initial question and it immediately tells you where you're going wrong or why you're not getting enough information of the type you want. So depending on your level of brewing experience, you might start dialing it back and going, okay, well, what equipment do I need to do this? I only know how to brew with extract, and you just keep asking the questions and being as thorough as you can with the description.
And the next beer will be an example of that, yeah. Yeah, so iterative process, building on the answers that it gives you and going there. So, any other questions on Badgie? Cool. All right. Oh, wait. Kurt still has a question.
Just a comment to come completely clean is that my last presentation, I started at the very beginning by going to Claude AI, which is an Anthropic product that I had just heard about at the time. And I just started using it to say, describe post-fermentation techniques for adjusting beer. Then I focused in on mineral adjustments. And then I said, make me a slide stack with the information. It doesn't do any graphics. It'll suggest graphics to you. But you can say, make me a slide stack. And they were both mostly text slides. And I probably used half of them and changed them a little bit as I was going along, deciding what I wanted to present and what not. But it gives you a basic backbone, and then you can start elaborating specifically on what you want to do. It takes a lot of work out of things.
And that was heavily considered for this presentation. However, I decided to do it the old meat way. So, okay, all right. So moving on. All right. So brewing challenge number 2. So
Thanks
what
for
I
coming
decided
clean,
to do for this one is pick a target BJCP style and say I want to brew something. Again, this was another one where I gave it my inventory list and said use that as the example. So.
All of this has happened before, and all of it will happen again.
All right, so this next beer is called Are You Alive? And if we can get my beer helpers to start passing this one around. All right, so I mentioned it before, but the Battlestar Galactica, the new series that happened in the early 2000s, that's what this is named after. So, as I mentioned, I basically generated this prompt using that seed PDF of my inventory again. You can use the pliers right there if you need them. Yeah, go on the nut that's there. There you go. Using the attached PDF from Brewfather, analyze the inventory currently on hand and create a recipe for an all-grain IPA. The recipe must contain at least 80% ingredients currently on hand. So not only did I give it the spreadsheet, but I gave it some boundaries. I said 80% of what you come up with, I already have to have physically on hand. The IPA recipe must also conform to the current BJCP style guidelines for 12A. I made a mistake. It should have been 21. I typed 12. Let's see how the AI responds to that.
Okay, I've analyzed the inventory list and created an all-grain IPA recipe that uses at least 80% of your on-hand ingredients and conforms to the BJCP 12A guidelines.
So it didn't pick up on the error. No, that was I fat finger typed it and mixed up my numbers. Yeah, that was a legitimate error on my part, but when I realized it, it hadn't caught it. So we're going to dive into that in a second. So my next question was, what batch size is this recipe for? So I'm starting to ask some clarifying questions to kind of make sure this recipe is going to come out where I expect it to. Its response was,
the recipe I provided is designed for a 5-gallon, 18.9 liter batch size. This is a common batch size for homebrewing and allows for reasonable usage of the available grain.
Okay, so all that checks out. So yet another clarifying question. I said, is this 5-gallon finished?
Yes, the recipe is designed to yield approximately 5 gallons, 18.9 liters, of finished beer.
Okay, so that all works. So this is where I then caught the mistake where I mistyped the BJCP, and I made yet another mistake trying to clarify the mistake. And again, I flipped my things around. I think I mistyped the BLCP. Category for American IPA, it should be 21A. It figured out what I was talking. Yes.
Were you drinking when you were putting this?
No, I just have there's a problem between the brain and the keyboard. So, all right, yeah, PepCAC, exactly.
You are correct. The BJCP category for American IPA is 21A, not 12A. I will update the recipe to reflect this. I've updated the immersive to reflect the correct BJCP category. Thank you for pointing out the mistake.
So not only did it fix it, it thanked me for giving it the correct information. So then my question was, okay, so now that you made that adjustment, yeah.
What is an immersive?
What is an immersive? Oh, so an immersive is basically the problem that it's working on, and it had already generated a recipe for me, so it went ahead and was adjusting that response that it gave me, right? So then the follow-up question is, did changing the category change any of the targets that it originally gave me? And it responded with,
great question. In this case, the target stats did not need to be significantly altered.
Okay, so all that seems good. So now, my next question, I proposed it. Since I only have a little over 10.5 pounds of Feldblum, which was the Admiral malt that I had on hand, I was going to use that as the base. I said, please adjust the recipe accordingly, and this is how it responded.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
The AI lost its freaking mind. It kept on going through and basically recycling the same answer until it hit some sort of timeout, and it basically said, I can't do that, right? So I decided, okay, I'm going to ask the question again, and let's see if we can at least somewhat get back on track. Ask the question again.
Here's an updated all-grain IPA recipe based on your Brewfather inventory, designed to meet the BJCP 21A American IPA style guidelines.
All right, so it recovered, right? So it basically, as I said, it lost its mind. I asked it the question again, it reanalyzed everything and ended up coming out. So, and if you're interested in exactly what garbage it gave me, there's a link to the Gemini listing there. So here's what it came back with. So target stats, 1060 to 1065, seems reasonable. FG, 1010 to 1018. So for some reason on this recipe and the next recipe I'll talk about, it flipped the order of the final gravity. I don't know if that means anything, but it was odd that it was an error that occurred twice. ABV of 6 to 7.5, IBU of 50 to 70, SRM 6 to 14. This gave me IBU and SRM, the other recipes didn't. Don't know why it decided to do it this time. A lot of times you can ask the same question in multiple sessions, and of course it's going to give you multiple answers. In this time, it just happened. IBU makes sense for an IPA SRM. It would be nice to know, but it's not a requirement. So grain, as I mentioned earlier to it, I said I want you to adjust it. It had originally said use 11 pounds of the Feldblum. I said I only have 10 and a half. That's when it lost its mind and then fixed itself. A little under a pound of crystal, half a pound of caramel Vienne, 3/4 pound of oats, hops. So these are all hops that I had on hand, which again was part of the criteria that I gave it. Let's use up, a lot of the hops I have in my freezer. This is what it came back with. Nothing out of the ordinary. All checks out. Yeast, safe ale, or a Y yeast American ale. Other Whirlfloc, of course, and yeast nutrients. And then brewing instructions, again, just put it up here for reference. Nothing out of the ordinary on this. It all makes perfect sense. So in this case, yeah. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, so just going back to this, you have
Sure.
Field Bloom as 24 Lovabond. Is that the addition that it's adding to the recipe? Because that is not the correct Lovabond for...
Okay, so that's a good catch. I didn't catch that. You're
Okay.
right. That is way off. So it came back with a number that is essentially not right. Now, I don't know where it came up with that. Yeah, it's higher than the pills, but not by much. So. I don't know that for certain. Yeah. I had bought one of the grains when we did the first Admiral malt bill. I had bought a sack of that, and I had been using it for everything. And this was the end of it. That's why there was 10 and a half.
So this is everything that came back. So it came back with the notes here for a touch of sweetness
Yes.
and body and
Yep.
all that kind of stuff. Okay.
I did summarize a few things for clarity just to fit on the slide.
Okay.
But for the most part, this is exactly as it presented it to
Okay,
me.
that's interesting. Yeah, it's just a lot of information that it's dumping out and giving to you.
It is,
which
but
is nice.
But as I mentioned before, it's not consistent because out of the 3 recipes, it gave me varying levels of detail on each one. So the stout one had about this level of detail. The one I'm going to show in a little bit, not so much detail. So again, it sometimes can be hit or miss on what you get back. So as I mentioned, brewing instructions, nothing out of the ordinary. Everything seems, everything makes sense. Nothing jumps out. So brewing challenge number 2, Are You Alive? How did it compare? So the AI calculated the OG at 1060, 1065, as I just mentioned. All this inputted to Brewfather, adjusted for my system, 1056, so a touch lower than it was saying. But my actual ended up 1062, so actual met more of what Gemini was saying. Final gravity, again, I have an asterisk up there just because it put the, 1018 seems awfully high, so I flagged that. Brewfather calculated is 1009, actual is 1010. So we're right within the range. ABV 6 to 7.5, calculated 6.2, I got 6.8. So again, it all seems to measure out so far. And if you're interested, again, there's the Gemini link, and there's the link to the actual input for Brewfather, so you can see the difference. Justin?
That's a really big range on all those fields the AI calculated, though.
It's
It's easy to be right when you're like, it's going to be between 0 and 8% alcohol. And,
It gave a pretty wide range on some of this stuff. I don't know if it's hedging its bets or that's just what it calculated. We don't really know on that. So, all right. So,
Andre.
Yeah, Louis.
Which Gemini model did you use when running these prompts?
So that's a good question. They increased it from 2 to 2.5. I believe the first recipe that I did, which I think was this one, was 2. I think the other ones were 2.5. So as AI improves, they basically add new features to it, and so they'll increase the version number of it. So it just happened I was in a weird point where it went from 2 to 2.5. So one would think as the number increases, they get better and better. So what does everybody think about this one? Yeah, so one note with this that didn't make it in the slides, I did find this with gelatin. The next beer I did that also. This thing came out really hazy, and it wasn't what the recipe, wasn't what I was expecting from the recipe. And I also haven't done any gelatin finding. I wanted to finally give that a shot, so this was kind of the guinea pig for that. So, and it cleared up significantly. So, all right, any other questions about this one or comments? All right, now let's get crazy. Brewing challenge number 3. So this is kind of this is an experimental beer, and if I had done this before Schiff, this may have been a good entry into Schiff for the experimental beer competition, but I was kind of thinking along those lines. My beginning prompt, and we'll go into the actual prompt in a second, was I want to brew something crazy. So keep that in mind when I introduce Data and his evil twin brother Lore.
I am superior, sir, in many ways. But I would gladly give it up to be human.
All right, so if you're gonna need 2 glasses for this, I have Data and Lore. We'll pass both out at the same time. If I can get 4 total people up here and pour. All right, so as I mentioned on this one, the prompt started out with, I want to brew something crazy. Taking from the worlds of beer, cider, mead, and sake, what's a good experimental beer recipe that I can try? Should be a 5-gallon finished batch. So I gave this the 5-gallon finished batch prompt up front instead of having to give it later on. Here is what Gemini came back with.
To brew something truly experimental that melds elements of beer, cider, mead, and sake, let's aim for a hybrid ale, an apple rice honey ale with a unique yeast profile and some interesting spice additions. This recipe is designed for a 5-gallon finished batch.
All right, so Gemini came back with a lot of information, so I distilled it down into some slides, a little different than I did the previous ones. Again, if you're interested, this QR code will come up later. This is exactly what Gemini came back with. I did ask it some clarifying questions, but they weren't necessarily relevant to the presentation, so this is what it came back with. So basically, it has a beer base. Like clean ale base provides the canvas. We use a significant portion of rice adjuncts to bring in the sake influence, or sake influence. Cider element, fresh apple juice, or a good quality apple cider with no preservatives will contribute the apple character. Mead influence, honey will add fermentable sugars, a unique flavor profile, and a touch of mead-like richness. Sake twist. The high proportion of rice combined with a potential co-fermentation or sequential fermentation with a sake yeast strain will be key. We'll also consider koji for enzymatic conversion if you're feeling adventurous, which I was. Crazy factor. This was a little crazy. Unique spice blend and a mixed fermentation approach. The spice blend, crazy. Mixed fermentation approach, not so crazy. So here's what it came back with. So target stats, OG 1070 to 1080, FG 1010 to 1020, nothing out of the ordinary. ABV 7.5 to 9, IBU 10 to 15, SRM 3 to 5. So again, it gave me more information on this one than the first recipe. Fermentables, 4 pounds of 2-row, 2 pounds of flaked rice, or rice hulls for easy lautering. So it basically was saying that rice hulls and flaked rice are equivalent. Okay. This is an example where you are able to take your knowledge and your experience in this and say, that's crap, right? It's not crap to add rice hulls. It's crap to say that it's equivalent to flaked rice. So 1 pound of carapils, 2 gallons of unpasteurized apple juice, 2 pounds of orange blossom honey, and half a pound to a pound of koji rice, inoculated rice for sake production. So koji is basically it's rice kernels that are infected with the koji fungus, and that allows in sake producing to break down the starches that are in the rice. The koji breaks those down into sugars that the yeast can eat, right? So this will convert starches to sugars. You'd ideally make a small moto, which is what you would call a sake starter, and add it to the main fermenter. If using koji, reduce the amount of flaked rice slightly, because again, the koji is the spores are on kernels of rice, so you can reduce your flaked rice accordingly. And since you're gonna get some of the starches out of that, you could possibly, the koji is gonna convert the 2-row starch. Hops, basically enough hops to say there's hops, right? A total of 1 ounce, 60 minutes at 60-minute boil and at 10 minutes, so. Again, hops just to say there's hops. So yeast, 1 packet of safe ale or Y yeast 1056, White Labs WOP 001, I used 001, figured let's just give it something clean fermenting right at the beginning. Secondary, 1 packet of Y yeast dry sake yeast. So I differed a little bit on this. I ended up getting some sake yeast from Travis. That's what I went with instead. I have experience in using that yeast before in sake, so I figured let's go ahead and throw that at that because that's more of a known for me. Now, spices are adjuncts. Optional, but highly recommended for the crazy factor. So they suggested 1 cinnamon stick crushed at flame outer and secondary, 4 to 5 cloves, same thing, half a teaspoon of nutmeg, 1 ounce of fresh ginger, thinly sliced, 1 zest of 1 orange. So, modifications I made to this. This recipe was all over the map. I needed to kind of rein it in ever so slightly. So what I decided to do, and the reason why you have data and lore, is I basically went ahead and split the batch. I added the Moto got added to both split batches, but I only spiced one of them. So lore is the Data's evil twin brother. Lore is the spiced version. Data is the nice clean version. So what I did was, at the end of the boil, I pulled approximately 1 liter of hot wort, added the spices to that, and then pitched that into the fermenter. So, and to account for that, I reduced all the spices by half because I didn't want to overspice this. I had a feeling it was going to be overly spiced to begin with, so I didn't want to go too much for a split batch. I added the honey at the end of the boil while it was still warm to help that integrate, so I didn't have all the honey sink to the bottom and then end up with problems with that. The apple juice went directly into the fermenter, and then I pumped the wort out of my kettle into the fermenters on top of the apple juice that was there. And then for the Moto, so what I did was I took some of the cooled wort off, went ahead and added the koji and the sake yeast to that, and that was the result. It basically blew off, and I lost probably half of my koji. So, but there was still enough in there that I definitely got what I was wanting out of it. I did also more heavily dose the koji. I added 1 pound total, so I went more on the high side for that. So fermentation, so what I did was I ended up pitching that Moto at day 3 of fermentation. Yeah.
What exactly are we looking at on the left picture there?
So
like, give us some, we need some details.
Okay.
That is
yeah, it looks like a white lava lamp. That is basically the wort that I did after cooling with 1 pound of koji and the sake yeast added to it. What you're seeing is it basically blew out, and I caught it all in a pot because I was smart and didn't want to make a mess in my fermentation chamber. So it's in a pot just for overflow because it's a flask. Yeah, it's a big Erlenmeyer flask. So, yeah, poorly composed picture. What was that, Jacques? So there was still enough in there that it still made sense to pitch, so I went ahead and did it. Again, I overdosed the koji to begin with, not expecting this to happen, but there was enough that we were still going to get the sake components from it. So, and then, as I said, I had pretty good fermentation just with the 001, and then at day 3 I added the Moto into that, and it went crazy. I mean, basically, you can see in the blow-off tubes there, that's basically all just stuff coming out into the bottle that I've got. So, all right. So because it was basically fermented at the same time with the same yeast and everything, the numbers are going to be the same. The only difference between these two is one is spiced and one is not. So that's the only difference. The numbers are going to be the same. AI calculated 1070 to 1080. Brewfather calculated 1053. Brewfather has a problem when using apple juice for doing ciders and things. It's very hard to nail that number down. So some of these Brewfather numbers aren't going to be exactly where it should be. Actual ended up 1052. So I did come close to what it calculated. Final gravity, again, it displayed it. 1020 is high for that. So Brewfather calculated it as under 1, which, again, it has an issue with apple juice. Actual ended up at 1008. AI said 7.5 to 9. Brewfather 7.2. I got 5.6, which is good. I didn't want this thing to finish too high. I wanted it still to be drinkable. So again, Gemini link and Brewfather link. What does everybody think? Andy. You're on.
I think this is an amazing beverage. I'm really enjoying this. Of the two, I like the one that is not the spiced one better. But if you take the spiced one and you add about 10% of it into the unspiced one, I think that's really. So the spices are really nice. I think they are really nice, and they're just still, really way overdone. Even though you dropped it in a half, it's still
Yeah,
They
and-
still gave you, because people are producing beers that have way too many spices in them.
Yeah, and that's why I
yeah.
did it the way I did it, because when I saw that, I said, yeah, this is way too heavy-handed with it. So
But I love the touch of the rice. So I'm getting the rice flavor. I'm getting the apple flavor. I'm getting beer flavor. I love that. It's a very unique beverage. I think it would have been great to have it for the experimental
it's
competition.
2 months too short. I wish I thought of it earlier.
Maybe for another competition. But I think if you were to take the spices, whatever you cut it in half, but now cut it again in a tenth and add that in there, and I think you've got something that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'll do if I'm doing a Thanksgiving turkey is I typically brine my turkey. And when I make my turkey brine ahead of time, it's pretty much most of what was in this beer. So when I was smelling it, it's like, this reminds me of Thanksgiving, which was a little off-putting. It's different once it's in the finished beer, but the essential extract that I made of it was way too Thanksgiving-y at that point. So that's why I was good. I did a split batch on that. Kurt.
I think you needed a post-fermentation adjustment.
Okay. And what would that be, Kurt?
Well, I just tried Andy's blending. That was a good one. But besides that, I think it could use a little pH adjustment. It needs to be, it's a little too acidic.
Yeah,
the finish is a little harsh.
It does have more of a tang to it than I was expecting.
I liked the spiced one better, even though I thought it was really heavy-handed. But I just tried what Andy said, and I thought that's really nice. Just a little bit of that in the other one, but it has a harsh finish.
Yeah, so I figured I was not going to like the spiced one. Again, that's why I decided to do the split batch. I wouldn't say I prefer the spiced one, but I don't think the spiced one is as horrible as I was expecting it to be. So one of the things on all these recipes, and I don't remember if I mentioned it before, but I tried my best to do exactly what the AI was telling me to do. I was really hoping for one of these to not turn out, because you can learn more in a failure than you can in something that you've done successfully. So, but all of these so far, and unless anybody has any other objections, have turned out to be very drinkable. So I'm pleased that it turned out that way. Justin.
Yeah, I got one more question. I was wondering what was going on with the pink can in the chest freezer there. That looks like it's for your temperature probe?
Yeah, so that's a heater. Yeah, that's actually
heater.
Jacques, I believe. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, there's a incandescent light bulb in there.
Oh, okay.
So it's hooked up to the heating port on the Inkbird. So if the temperature, it's not useful now, but in the winter it is actually very useful. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions on data and or lore? Louis. Oh, Judith, actually.
Lauren beat Katie. I'm real interested in the whole question formulation concept, because I work with a lot of college students who don't know how to ask a good question. Truly, it's a learned skill. When you use the term crazy, did you ask the AI to tell you how it defined that word? I mean, it can mean a lot of things. That's pretty open.
You're right, it can. So in this instance, I did not, but so in using Gemini, when it gives you an answer, will allow you to dig deeper into the answer, and it allows you to see some of the data that it used and the sources that it used for something, for its answer that it generated. I didn't look into this one and see how it defined crazy. What it came back with was pretty damn crazy. So I'm satisfied that it, understood, the criteria that I was giving it. So, but question creation is an important part of this, and you have to be able to form your question. It's getting better to understand if you formed your question as you would form talking to someone. It's able to parse that better, but you do still have to kind of look at your question and say, how can I make this more clear so there's less ambiguity in it? So, you do still have to do some of that yourself before you do it. It's not completely at the point where you can just give it a prompt 100% and it's going to understand it 100%. You still have to do some self-editing. So I guess that's probably the best way to put it. Chris.
You say AI calculated. I've had both Gemini and ChatGPT tell me numerous times it's not actually calculating, that all it goes off of is it's a language model. It knows that this number is associated with this type of grist, but is not actually calculating it.
Correct, and that's probably, I probably should have picked a better word for that, but you're right. This is basically what AI gave me. It said that the SG is going to be within this range, the FG is going to be within this range. You're right. It's probably not actually calculating that by getting the information about the grain. It's not doing the level that Brewfather is doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you can see your actual and what Brewfather calculated is very different than what AI thought it knew.
Yes. However, as I mentioned earlier, Brewfather has a hard time with apple juice. You have to manually put in that information, and if you don't have it exact, which I'm not 100% certain I have it exact, it's going to miss anything that has a fruit juice component to it. I did a cherry cider, which I'll bring next meeting, and I did my best to get all the information in there because it didn't have the cherry extract I used and didn't have the apple juice. So the numbers it came back with was who knows what. So you have to understand, at least in this case, that it's not going to. My numbers are off, but it may be off for a different reason than what Brewfather did. If you look at the other recipes, what Brewfather calculated and what AI gave me were a lot closer. Right?
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. Takeaways. So I mentioned these before. They're important enough to go over again. And of course, I got Agent Smith from the Matrix on the corner there. So treat AI like another tool in your toolbox. AI is, the way that I think AI should be treated, excuse me, is that treat it like a reference book. Treat it like an extra data point that you have, not necessarily as the complete final answer to anything that you're doing. I'm all choked up. Well, I'll drink a little bit of lore. Figure this cinnamon will kill that. So, trust but verify. We're all engineers here, right? We have a good brewing background. Make sure that whatever AI tells you, you're using critical thinking and you're making sure that, excuse me, use critical thinking to make sure that what AI is giving you is somewhat correct. Because otherwise it could be feeding you stuff that's just garbage and you have to use some of your own knowledge to be able to source that out. So, any questions? Anything we haven't covered so far? Kurt.
This is a comment, not a question. I think that the next time I give a talk, you should give me one of those head-mounted microphones.
We do have a couple of those.
Very, very good point.
A leash.
All right. So this is great. I love what you're telling us in here. There's a lot of neat things that you can use AI for brewing. But did you know that you can also use AI for helping you to make labels too?
Yep.
So it can actually make labels up for you. And I should have brought it. I didn't even think about it, but I should have brought it. But I made up a label for a brew that Lauren Maraglia and Chad Stevens we brewed together, and it's a quad. And he had this idea that he wanted the name of the beer to be Dudes and Corollas. And so I thought, well, that's a crazy name, because he said, well, it's kind of like Good and Corollas, you know, and people mistook it that he was talking to for Dudes and Corollas, and so he thought it'd be a cool name, and so we named the beer that we collaborated on, and because it was such a crazy, wacky name, I thought, well, I would reach out to AI and have a label made for me, and it took a lot of tries for it, and I kept having to tell it to do this and do that, but I basically uploaded pictures of myself and Lauren and Chad, and I was trying to get them to put us driving the Corollas. And we got partway there, but then I had to, basically edit it afterwards, post-edit it. And if you're willing to post-edit it, you can get a really good start on a great label. I'm not going to say that it's going to make the great label all the way for you. You're going to want to make probably some changes to it, but you can use AI to help you make some beer labels. I'll bring it next meeting so you guys can check it out.
Now, let's not put good artists like Todd out of work, but it can supplement some of that. So this image I've had on the meeting agenda slides for a couple months now for the presentation. Basically, I said I want a robot holding a glass of beer, looking, contemplatively at it. This was probably the third or fourth iteration. I said, okay, I want it to look more like Data from Star Trek. It gave me a few things that were off. And it gave me an image close to this, and something that I didn't catch until my daughter was looking at it. He ended up having another set of eyes down by his neck, and there was something else there. And so I thought that it was more of a feature, like in his jawline or something. And once I zoomed in on it, it was freaking eyes. So again, AI isn't 100%. You have to do some adjustments with it. Otherwise, you blindly trust it, and you end up with 8 fingers and eyes in the middle of your forehead. Lauren.
Andre, thank you so much. I thought that was a really cool presentation.
And thank you, Rich.
So one of the things I was wondering, and I've noticed this, I'm really just a beginner at trying to use it, but you can have like these conversations, and they'll save the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm wondering is, if you continue to go back to the conversation and ask the AI, different questions, like, and in some cases, it could be a question about like a grain that you're not familiar with, things like that. Do you think that if you keep on using it in that way, as opposed to like starting a fresh conversation, it would be different or more beneficial to what you're trying to do?
Yeah, it'll be different, definitely. Whether it's more beneficial or not, I don't know. What it's going to have to do is, once you've stopped whatever session you're doing, if you come back to it a few days later, it basically has to analyze everything you've asked and everything that it's responded to be able to figure out what you're trying to ask your follow-up question with. So, I mentioned it earlier and I didn't dive into it, and I'll mention it now. So, one of the questions that I had when it gave me the experimental data and lore was, and actually, Rich, you and I have talked about this. What does Koji add? Right? That's something we've never been able to get a straight answer on. Some places say if you add Koji to beer, it adds a tartness to it. It's like doing a kettle sour. Some, like this recipe said, you're going to get more of a rice character from it. So a couple days later, after talking with my dad and going over the recipe, he said, well, why don't you ask it what Koji is going to add? And so I did ask it that question. But what it had to do is it had to reanalyze everything it had already told me to figure out how best to answer from there. So it was almost like starting a new prompt, but with data to support it. So, and in this case, it didn't really give me a definitive answer. It kind of just supported what you and I had thought, is that, yeah, depending on where you use it, it could add some tartness to it. If you add it later, it could add, it basically adds a rice character. The Koji may convert some of the starches, but it was like, yeah, I don't know. So, and it depends on what type of Koji, whether you're using yellow or white. Those are different variants of Koji, and they do different things. So, yeah.
So, I have not actually brewed all the different styles that are out there, but what I found is if you're not internet savvy, there's a book that was released many years ago by a guy named Jamil Zainashev called Brewing Classic Styles, and you can buy that book on Amazon for like $17.40. They have one left. However, you can get a used one for $9, and it's in very good condition. So, I mean, if you're not so sure that you know what you want, check out Jamil's book.
Yes, and so the majority of the recipes that I do either come from that book or they come from Brewlosophy experiments. So, that, as I said, AI is another tool in your toolbox. That book is a tool in your toolbox. You need to be able to know how to use all that stuff effectively. So, any other questions? I'm sorry? Yeah, for Forbidden Planet. Robbie the robot? All right. That is it. Thank you.